Chris, one of the arguments for the existence of God from all religions is revelation. Revelation scares me a bit because I haven't had one, and I don't know why I should ever trust somebody who did. So how do we begin to deal with revelation?
That's a good question, especially at the individual level, because as you say, there are some people, and I'm one of them, who have had an experience that have actually just simply convinced me that, that the God thing is something I've got to deal with. And lots of other people, often better people than I am, simply haven't had that. And equally, I'm quite convinced that I can't argue anybody into the, believing in the existence of God. I can point out some of the flaws in the arguments against the existence of God that are around. There are lots of those. And a lot of the arguments for atheism that are around at the moment are pretty poor. But nevertheless, even when I've dealt with those, ultimately all I can do in talking to anybody is hope that ultimately the penny will drop, so to speak, as we say in England, that that new way of looking in the world will come. And it will come in a way which ultimately isn't rational. That doesn't mean it's irrational, but there is something else. We have something as over and above our rational mind and even our emotions, which ultimately is what sort of grabs us, if you like, and takes us into that.
I guess there are two kinds of revelation, if we want to divide it up. One is you're describing something that we'd have personally, which many people describe, which, as I said, I have not had and don't necessarily want and wouldn't trust it if I had one. And then there are the revelations that are in the scriptures of virtually all religions, which claim shall we say, a universal validity in terms of how God is dealing with great questions. Yet all of these kinds of revelations have a cultural basis whenever they had. And then people ask, well, there's no revelation like that today. And so how do you deal with those kinds of grand revelations from a cultural or psychological basis?
Well, first of all, the understanding of that sort of revelation comes in two forms. One is to say this is simply God revealing himself, full stop. Most Muslims, for example, see the Quran as literally God's word, God speaking in Arabic, dictating it to the Prophet. I think many people within the Christian world, particularly in the last 60 or 70 years, have actually wanted to have a much more subtle understanding of revelation than that. And there is a recognition that God works in and through, first of all, our particular psychological makeup, and secondly, as part of that, with the particular cultural situation in which we exist. So I've written, for example, a little bit, very tentatively, about the resurrection appearances of Christ, for example, which when you first look at them, you think, well, what on earth is this about? But when you recognize, first of all, that the Judaism of that period had only in the last 100 or 200 years started to think about the resurrection of the dead as a concept, very much part of what was going on. Secondly, had a very strong sense of the end of the age, which was going to involve this. Then to actually say, well, God works in and through those cultural expectations and all of that sort of, if you like, the psychological baggage that goes with that, then that's one possible way of understanding why the particular revelation that Christians see in the person of Jesus of Nazareth culminated in that particular way. Now, that doesn't mean that it's therefore false, that we can reduce it to psychology or sociology or something else, but it actually says that is the way that divine revelation works. It always comes in and through the particular cultural and psychological situation of the people who receive it. And that, for me, is the reason why, in fact, I'm very happy to talk in pluralistic terms about religions. I don't simply believe that because of my own Christian framework talks in that way, that another revelation that may exist in the world, and there are plenty of them, is therefore necessarily false or incomplete, because those revelations themselves, again, have come out of a very particular psychological and cultural framework.
Does that mean that we have to do a critical analysis of the revelation to determine, to tease apart the psychological, the cultural, and then the perhaps supernatural component, which may be all mixed in a complex waveform of sorts?
I think we need to think about those issues. I'm not sure there's ever a very simple answer. Often, I think what we're doing in theology is just being aware of the components of the situation, and saying, but we don't always know where the borderline exists between.
But if you're willing
the
to
one and the
admit
other.
in revelation situations that there are the psychological and cultural components, it will at least begin to focus your attention in a different way.
It does. It does, undoubtedly.
It will make some degrade the entire thing to some degree in terms of it sort of leaches out the absolute fundamental, absolute power and certainty of that event, if you can explain it in cultural terms.
You can explain it always partly in cultural terms, but for me, you've actually got to go right back to the beginning. What is it to be a human being? Now, for me, what it is to be a human being is to be part of God's creation. Now, if you assume that God has created human beings through the evolutionary process, we don't necessarily have to do any special process to do this, but if God has created human beings with a particular psychological makeup, if God has created human beings so that, in a sense, they're open to these, what we might call revelatory experiences, then that, for me, is the fundamental. And the reason I can then say that the particular, if you like, historical revelation, which at some point in my life grabbed me, that's the one I go with. But as I say, that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily in any way downgrading it or certainly not reducing it. I'm not saying, look, this is just psychological, sociological. I'm saying that's part of what that is. But I still go with that particular revelation. But when somebody else goes with another one, I might still be able to be critical about their revelation. But I'm certainly not going to say to them, because mine's right, yours must be wrong or incomplete. That's the important thing for me.